Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for the nice introduction. I don't know whether if you were 7th on the list, I was 10th on the list or anything like that, but it's very nice to be here and it's very nice to have a chance to talk a little bit. I'm not going to do slides, I'm just going to talk about transport and climate change. Like you said, I'm the Secretary General of the International Transport Forum. It's a governmental organisation that brings 50 countries together, and we have talked about transport and the environment, and now transport and climate change, for a long time, for almost 20 years. So I have seen how the governments have changed, how the declarations and how the reality go together. So I'll speak a little bit about that. We're very pleased to be here also with David, and because we do a lot of work together on the GFEI, the Global Fuel Economy Initiative, and David's going to talk a little bit more about that, but we are part of the partnership in that. So we do a lot of things to try and advance the transport and environment agenda in general, but in particular on climate change. And I just want to speak a little bit about that. But perhaps the first thing I would do is I'd give you a bit of background on transport. Maybe you know it, but maybe it's no harm to set the scene. The second thing, then I would talk a little bit about the politics, and then in my third section talk a little bit about what we should be doing. Well, in terms of the broad trends and data, maybe you know it, but it's no harm to remind you that transport accounts for about a quarter of emissions from fuel consumption, about 15% of man-made emissions. These two distinctions are often necessary. And the amount of transport emissions is growing. It's growing absolutely, and it's growing relatively. In terms of the modes, the modal shares vary by country, but broadly speaking, road transport, trucks and cars account for about 3/4 of the emissions, air and shipping about 10% each of the transport emissions, and rail and other things make up the remaining little piece. These vary by country, but roughly that gives you the broad picture. Now, these emissions have been growing. Unfortunately, we know the most effective way to halt the growth in emissions. It's to have a recession. And that's worked very effectively in the early 90s in many of the Nordic countries, and we've seen it again in 2008, 2009. This recession brought transport emissions down almost everywhere. Now, the fact now is that the emissions are now growing again, and the signs are that total global emissions from all sources in 2010 will be the highest ever recorded, and this is also true in transport, because transport rebound has been actually bigger than the rebound in other sectors. This growth in emissions from transport is mainly in the developing world, though transport continues also to grow in the developed world. Some countries, though, in the developed world have managed to halt the rising transport emissions. Even before the crisis, places like Germany, France, and Japan all halted emissions before the crisis. In transport, the high fuel prices and the recession have seen declines in miles travelled, with a levelling off before the crisis even in some countries, and this sparking a discussion about peak travel. Have we reached peak miles travelled? And this is an interesting discussion in itself, and I would just make the comment that the answer is probably no. There are particular reasons for peaking in certain countries, but even in OECD countries, there still seems to be growth ahead in miles travelled. There have been, of course, a lot of positive developments in the sense that we have moved forward with CO2 standards in the European Union, in Japan, in US, and China is looking at emissions controls and bringing emissions per vehicle down. We do see enormous emission variations. So in terms of per capita emissions from transport, they vary enormously. So from the peak of about 6 tons per person in the US to less than 1/10 of a ton in India. So the emissions per capita from transport are 60 times higher in US than in India. So there's a lesson there about moralizing as well, that obviously there's a great growth to come, and those with the highest emissions should be rather careful about lecturing the others about what they're doing. Now, all of that gives a kind of a quick overview of what's happening in the transport sector. So emissions rising, emissions mainly from road, improvements being made, but I think what we see is that there are a lot of pressures in the transport sector for emissions to grow, and there are a lot of forces driving a growth in emissions. And you might say, well, first of all, the world population is going to go from 6 billion to 9 billion, so these people are going to be mobile, so that's a huge source of growth. Things like aviation is a rather young industry. I mean, people of my generation probably didn't fly till they were 20. There are many people in China and India who haven't flown yet. So it's still a young industry. So there's an enormous growth ahead in aviation. Car ownership is extremely low in many parts of the world. The figures I gave earlier illustrate it. So there's an enormous growth to come in car ownership in many parts of the world. You might say there are good reasons for China or India to restrict, limit somehow the rate of growth of car ownership, and indeed there are, but the likelihood of those policies being implemented and put into place seem to me to be fairly limited. So there's a major growth to come. Urbanization, and especially suburbanization, continues apace around the world, and urbanization maybe you can manage to keep emissions reasonably under control and use public transport and other modes of transport. But suburbanization, which is in many places very car dependent, seems likely to continue, and that's another factor that we will see a lot of car growth. Global trade is set to increase. I mean, it has bounced back very strongly from the recession, and there are many reasons to believe that global trade might grow by threefold to 2050. So there are many factors driving transport emissions up, and factors that are good for our societies and for our economies as well. So this is part of the difficulty. Now, I should say there are some countervailing trends that often people mention. Aging is one thing that you may see some decline in driving because of aging, maybe a little. Certainly young people are delaying purchase of a car. If you ask a young person now whether they'd give up their car or their mobile phone, they might give up the car. But I think our generation wouldn't do that. So maybe there are some trends there in the way young people are delaying purchase of a car and so on. There's certainly a growth and even a renaissance in some cities in cycling, in walking, in public transport, and policies pushing strongly in those directions are seeing growth in public transport in many places. So all of those are definitely making what I would call a countervailing trend. But on the other hand, the forces I have described are so strong that our forecast, our projection for the future is that we see 2- to 3-fold increase in global mobility and a doubling of global emissions by 2050. Now, there are lots of ifs and buts to those figures, but I just give them to you. And this would be despite the big efficiency improvements we're seeing in all the modes of transport. You see, for example, container ships now are nearly up to 17,000 TEUs. You see the A380 in aviation, and you see the improvements in truck efficiency. Even bigger trucks now are being discussed. All of these unit efficiency improvements are happening across the transport modes, but they're being swamped by the growth in the volumes, so that we're getting efficiency improvements of 2% a year, for example, in aviation, but the growth is 6%. So the emissions are still continuing to grow. So that's the framework, I think, for the transport sector.